Earlier this week, the ACT government made the announcement that new fossil-fuelled vehicles would be banned from sale from 2035. There'll also be an increase in the number of charging stations for electric vehicles, and registration for electric vehicles will be made cheaper, all as part of the Zero Emissions Vehicle Plan. Some have said, well, this is craziness. Others have said, well, it's too little too late. One of those who says Australia's not moving quickly enough is Matthew Dickerson, technologist, futurist and host of Tech Talk, who's written an opinion piece published by the Canberra Times today. Matthew, thanks for joining us. Why do you think Australia's moving too slowly?
That's a very good question, Leon. If I had the answer to that, I'd think I'd solve lots of other problems around the world. But we certainly do seem to be moving very slowly, which is unusual because Australians in general are pretty quick at adapting to new technology. And one of the things I think with electric vehicles is we have had some governments across the nation that have put some negativity, some doubt in people's minds around electric vehicles. You may remember not the last federal election, but the election before, there was talk about electric vehicles going to ruin our weekends and they couldn't possibly be good performance, or you couldn't possibly have a youth that went well if you had an electric vehicle, which of course is all rubbish. So people in their minds, I think, have been a little bit against it. So I do applaud the ACT government for coming out and making these statements, making these rules. I'm not sure that you'd call them laws because 2035 is a long way off. And of course, one law in place right now could be changed very easily by any future government. But it certainly is an indication, a sign that we're moving in the right direction. So when I saw the announcement, I was a bit excited and a bit disappointed all at the same time. So it's a bit of a strange emotion.
Okay. A lot of people have been very critical of this decision for a variety of different reasons. Many people are concerned about the range of electric vehicles, the time it takes to recharge electric vehicles, the battery life of an electric vehicle before you have to throw it away and get another vehicle. These are all issues that have not yet been properly resolved, aren't they?
Well, I don't know how many hours we've got to talk about this, Leon, but those are all issues that I hear every day, and they're such old-fashioned ideas that people really haven't spent the time in actually having a bit of a look at it and seeing what the real story is. Just to give you a bit of background, I've got 4 electric vehicles that I own. I haven't put petrol in a car since 2015, and all those things that you talk about are things that people pop up. So I'll very quickly address some of those. The range is obviously one of the first things that people hit you with. I can't possibly jump in the car in Canberra and drive all the way to Perth. What a terrible idea having this electric vehicle. Of course, no one ever does jump in the car in Canberra and drive all the way across to Perth. Most people use their car to drive fairly short trips. It might be just drive downtown, drop kids to school, drive into work. The average Aussie spends maybe 30 or 40 kilometres at most in an average day in their vehicle. So the whole idea that they need to be able to drive 1,000 kilometres at a time is a bit of a furphy. But the other part is that what you typically should be doing when you're driving those long distances, if you do want to jump in the car in Canberra and drive to Brisbane or drive some long distance, you should be stopping every couple of hours from a drive revive perspective. You shouldn't be getting in the car and just driving non-stop for 10 hours. So I know when I plan my trips, if I'm driving somewhere, one of my cars, for example, I could drive 632 kilometres in one go if I wanted to, but I don't, because I'll normally drive for a couple of hours and I'll stop, and the time it takes me when I stop somewhere, grab a coffee, maybe go to the toilet and get back in my car, what I do is I plan where I stop, and I stop at a charging station. When I plug it in and do all that, by the time I've finished my coffee and then got ready to get back in the car, it's put back in the charge that I've had to do, rather than standing at a petrol station and sitting there twiddling my thumbs for 5 minutes while I fill up with petrol. So it's the way you approach it that's a bit different.
At the same time, though, if I drive from Canberra to Queensland, which I've done many times now, I've got to say, I like the freedom that I can stop when I feel like it, and there's always petrol stations around.
Yeah, and that certainly is a valid argument that there is more flexibility when you've got petrol stations. So when I'm driving a long trip, I do plan it. I look at a map and I say, right, I've got to drive from A to B. Where are the stops along the way? Oh, good, I'll stop there and I'll stop there. And then I normally plan my stops about every 2 to 3 hours apart because it's a bit safer. And then those stops are about 5 minutes. So the whole idea, people always say, how long does it take to charge when it's dead flat? And I can tell them that time, and it's not as long as people think. But the reality is I very rarely do it. It's not like you drive your car till the red light's on and then you risk it for another 30 or 40 kilometres till you finally pull up for petrol. You fill up for petrol at convenient stops along the way. But you're right, it's more convenient. And if you go back 100 years, there probably weren't many petrol stations around and people had to carry jerry cans with them. So we're at that point now where we'll see more charging stations.
All right. Now, there's a couple of other issues I'd like to cover off today before we run out of time, but obviously one of them is the idea that this legislation is even necessary in the ACT because the manufacturing sector, and let's face it, we don't have one in Australia anymore, the manufacturing sector is adopting this new technology anyway. We've got mandates in most of Europe, in fact all of Europe, I believe, to ban the sale of internal combustion engines by 2035 at the latest. So who's going to manufacture the internal combustion engine cars that people here in Canberra might still want to buy?
I think you're right. That's probably the thing about this announcement. It does signal that Canberra and the ACT is going in the right direction, but the reality is you'll struggle to find a new internal combustion engine car in the year 2035. The bans that are being put in place around the world are typically much more aggressive than that. You've got places like Norway, which is really leading the world. They're banning from 2025. You've got lots of cities and countries banning from 2030. You can find lots of examples around the world of those bans coming in much earlier than 2035. But I think you're right. By 2030, but by 2035, it'll be a real struggle to find a new internal combustion engine car. So does it really matter? Does the legislation really make a difference? It really is only about signalling to the world, signalling to residents of the ACT that they should really start looking at this new direction for vehicles.
The other thing that has cropped up is that those in the automotive industry have suggested that this particular ban on selling internal combustion vehicles is the wrong way to go, and the right way to go is to introduce technology agnostic legislation that limits emissions or requires a zero emission outcome by a certain date, allowing the development of any other technology that might also deliver the same outcome.
Yeah, and hydrogen's probably the most common one that's spoken about there, and I've actually driven a couple of different hydrogen vehicles, and a hydrogen vehicle drives just the same as an electric vehicle, and electric vehicles are a fantastic car to drive. So the whole idea about this technology agnostic solution, I don't think a ban on internal combustion engine vehicles changes that problem, because all it's saying is you can't have a petrol car, you can't have a diesel car, but you can have hydrogen, you can have electric, you can have any other solution that people come up with, which there will be new solutions that people come up with going forward, but it just can't be based around burning oil. And I think that's okay.
All right, but I have read that Porsche, for example, is investing millions of euros in developing a synthetic fuel so they can keep burning a form of petrol that's carbon neutral, and therefore they can keep on making their glorious flat six Porsche sports cars.
Yeah, and Porsche have been doing some work on synthetic fuels. There's a few companies around the world doing that. The problem there is that they're really, and I think even Porsche themselves would admit, they're really doing that as a stopgap measure. It doesn't seem to be their final solution. So that might be some way of getting people to the point of maybe a transition, getting them so they can keep that old car, that old sound and feel of a car until they finally do go to something that's a more modern technology. The legislation can be changed. If it came out that someone came out with some wonderful solution they could produce from plants and they could put that into cars and run the cars on that, I'm sure the technology could be changed. If there's a company out there that's manufacturing something that's so brilliant that it's going to replace the need for electric vehicles and hydrogen and come up with some of the new solution, I think various governments around the world would adopt that very quickly. At the moment, we're seeing some work being done on synthetic fuels, but again, it seems to be, even if you speak to Porsche, it seems to be that that's more a stopgap than a final solution.
Matthew, thanks very much for chatting today.
Always my pleasure, Leon.
Thank you. Matthew Dickerson, technologist, futurist and host of Tech Talk, right here on 2CC.